Good morning. This is Mr. Mike for the Mechanicsburg Learning Center, coming to you live, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time every day. We are about to present episode number 52 of Mr. Mike's Dino-A-Day in association with the Mechanicsburg Learning Center. Why in the heck am I holding an elephant? Elephants aren't dinosaurs, right? No. Usually, the reason people bring up elephants when they talk about dinosaurs is because this is the largest land mammal that we know of, the largest land mammal that's living today. And for size comparison, when you talk about dinosaurs, it's really convenient for us to say, this thing weighed as much as 8 elephants, or it was as long as 4 elephants, or something like that, because people can put an elephant into perspective. Sometimes the size of these other animals, it's just tough to put into perspective because they were so huge. Such is the case with today's animal. Not classified as a dinosaur, not a pterosaur. It is an ancient mammal with several names. Let's get right to it. The name that we're going to use today is the name that science recognizes. It goes by another name which the public is a little bit more familiar with, but frankly, I'm guessing that either of these names, most people that you would socially distance pass in some retail establishment, a few months from now, you could go up to ask them, what's the largest animal that ever lived on land, and then give them a name, and they would say, oh, I never heard of such a thing. This, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is Paraceratherium, otherwise known as Sgrignoli, and there are several other names it's gone by. Let me get you the list. Paraceratherium, Sgrignoli, Thaumastotherium, and the list goes on. There have been at least 6 different names that Paraceratherium has gone by since it was discovered, which was way back in 1910. Now, the reason there's been so many names is because they kept thinking that every time they found a bone that actually belonged to Paraceratherium, well, they thought it was a completely new genus and they were excited, so they gave it a name. However, of late, some of these names have started to fold back into or come under the umbrella of Paraceratherium. So that is what paleontologists and scientists name the animal, but it would not be incorrect for you to also refer to it as Sgrignoli. So let's start with Paraceratherium. I have 2 definitions of that name: hornless beast or near horn beast. Now let's take a close look at it. Okay, certainly doesn't have a horn. Has a very interesting mouth, which we'll talk about later. They said that this animal was or is related to the rhino. It doesn't look like a rhino, but if you go to a museum and see one of these on display, you may see it shown just with, the bones, or they may have put flesh on it and tried to make it look like it would appear if it were walking around today. And when they do that, sometimes they have that folded skin that is typical that you see on a rhino. But it is related to the rhino, but then again, it's also related to this animal. At least this is what they've said. Did have a long neck, like to gobble leaves from the treetops, so maybe it's a little bit like a giraffe. And when you talk about a giraffe, they say, well, then, because it may be related to the giraffe, kind of had a body like one of these, which is an okapi, which is a very giraffe-like headed animal, much smaller, but sort of a mishmash of a couple of different kinds of animals. Okapi, love the okapi. So we've talked about an elephant, we've talked about a giraffe, we've talked about an okapi, and then they say, well, let's talk about the face for a second, and let's look at the mouth of a camel or dromedary. And really, as far as the models are concerned, yeah, I could see that. Couldn't you? They're a little similar. That fleshy upper lip is why they got there. Now, let's add another animal to the mix. They took a look at that lip and said, just like we were discussing with Macrocenia a few episodes ago. Take a look at that one if you need a refresher course on Macrocenia, the animal that was discovered by Charles Darwin that they had some conjecture saying, well, maybe it had sort of a snout. So as far as Paraceratherium is concerned, they say, well, maybe it had a snout like the ever lovable, one of my favorite animals of all time, the tapir. And the reason they come up with this is because they look at the skull, and the way the skull is built can somehow show you, where the nostril holes are. If they're high on the skull, then it may have had a snout, and it did happen to have that. So, did it have a little snout? We may never know, or we may find out tomorrow with a new discovery. So, Paraceratherium, also known as Sgrignoli. Now, the Sgrignoli name comes from a Russian folklore tale of the strongest animal in the world, Indrik. So, that's what it's named after. The word therium means beast, so anytime you hear the word therium at the end of an animal name, I was going to say 100% of the time, but it's not true. 99.99999% of the time, it's referring to a mammal, not a dinosaur. However, there have been a couple of dinosaurs with the word therium at the end just to confuse us. This Paraceratherium lived somewhere in the neighborhood of 33 to maybe 23 million years ago. So this obviously came after the dinosaurs, and it is not a dinosaur, it is a mammal. As I mentioned, it was discovered in 1910. They call the lip a prehensile lip, okay? A fleshy lip, which they're trying to figure out, did it have a snout or was it built like this? Not much in the way of ears, we think, but some reconstructions show more rhino ears, which are more pointed. An animal that is so huge, it's hard to fathom how big this was. Let me give you the numbers on it. The thing stood between 33 and 40 feet long. That is longer than Stegosaurus. Its neck itself was over 6 feet long. Let's just think about that. So if I stood up, I'm about the height of the Paraceratherium neck, just the neck. Overall, it stood somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 to 18 feet tall. That would put Mr. Mike somewhere in this neighborhood. Let's put this in perspective. I'll put it up on the board so it's even easier for you to see. Here's the Paraceratherium. Mr. Mike walks along and, no, Mr. Mike, you're way too tall. You need to be down about here. Okay? Not even up to its shoulder blades. About here, Mr. Mike, is where you would be. This, ladies and gentlemen, is one big animal. Big, 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 big. Now, if you have trouble remembering the word, break it up. Sarah. Maybe you have a friend named Sarah. Paraceratherium. Therium meaning beast. So it was basically a gigantic, hornless rhino. Note how skinny its legs were. Now, in comparison, if you went up and saw this animal, yeah, the legs would be pretty big, but look at the size of the legs, how skinny they are compared to the rest of the body. They were extremely strong. They had to be because they were holding up a gigantic beast with a very long neck. But did it mean that it was fast? Heck no. It needed the muscles on the legs just to hold it upright, okay? This thing didn't go running. If you had an animal this big, just like the dinosaurs, when you have a gigantic animal, if it would fall and maybe break a leg, the animal probably would never get up again. So these animals had to be careful. That's why the gigantic sauropod, the long neck guys, moved around slowly. You didn't want to trip, because that trip may mean the end. It was 100% herbivorous. This thing did not go after animals. Probably couldn't catch them. It just stood around, found the closest gigantic tree, and then nibbled from the very tip tops of the trees to get those tender new leaves that no other animal could hope to reach. Great name for the person that discovered it in 1910, Sir Clive Forster Cooper. Love that name. Try fitting that into a poem. Which is, by the way, what we do every day. If you're just tuning in for the first time, we talk about an animal and then I write a poem about it. So, neck was over 6 feet long. There is a, if you guys know your Star Wars trivia, those big animals, those big machines that walked on the snow, they call them AT-ATs. If you take a look at, maybe you have an AT-AT model yourself, or maybe you just want to review the film. If you look at the AT-AT, the AT-AT, from the folks that made Star Wars, designed how this thing looked and walked after this animal. So, if you can believe it, the Paraceratherium had a starring role in the Star Wars movies. So I mentioned that it had several names. In 1989, the team of Lucas and Subas did a study and discovered that the animal was in fact related to rhinoceroses. So we now know that all the other animals mentioned, it may have some physical characteristics that resemble it, but this thing was basically just the ancient, overgrown ancestor of a rhinoceros. Okay, one more final fact about it which I found fascinating. If you think about discovering these animals and maybe discovering a skull or a neck bone or something like that, it's pretty incredible to be holding something in your hand that hasn't been seen alive on Earth by any other human that could be millions of years old. And a very famous early explorer of dinosaurs was a gentleman by the name of Roy Chapman Andrews, or as I like to call him, RCA for short, Roy Chapman Andrews. You might want to make sure you Google him and find out all about him. This gentleman was so interesting, an interesting character, and if you look at some of the photographs, he kind of reminds you of some famous person that's been portrayed in films by the name of Indiana Jones. So there's some conjecture, a theory that perhaps Indiana Jones was based on this legendary fossil finder named Roy Chapman Andrews. That's the signal that we just got telling me it's time to move forward, Mr. Mike, and it's time to read the poem. So let's go ahead and do that. The poem all about Paraceratherium, which was not only difficult to rhyme with, but I somehow had to fit in the word Sgrignoli too, so people know that they are the same beast now. Now, there's a couple things I want you to pay attention to in the poem. If you've ever heard of something called alliteration, when you're writing a poem, sometimes you can use alliteration. Alliteration is using the first letter of a word several times in several words. So if I said Mr. Mike, those are two M's in a row, that would be alliteration. So it's always fun to try to fit in a couple of words in a row that start with the same letter. It just makes for a more challenging thing to do when you're writing a poem that has to be fact-packed and based on information that you want to try to shove into a poem that is easily read and understood. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm going to provide, for the first time, episode 52, a little musical background, original music by Mr. Mike that will accompany the reading of the Paraceratherium poem. The Paraceratherium, your size was awe-inspiring, but keeping up with what they call you, that is really tiring. I texted my librarian to pinpoint largest creature, but I must say I'm on my own because I couldn't reach her. So first of all, when naming you, it's gotten complicated. A scientific name depends on when the name was dated. You've gone by several names, it seems, and each is somewhat valid. So listen close and I'll recite your legendary ballad. Sgrignoli is what some people like to call you, and you are so gargantuan, no beast could hope to maul you. But when they looked more closely at your bones, they then decided you're Paraceratherium, but some remain divided. Discovered back in 1910 by Sir Clive Forster Cooper, the sheer immenseness of your bones left people in a stupor. Related to the rhino, that sounds right, but so much larger. Unlike the rhino, though, you're way too huge to be a charger. Some say giraffe is more akin to your preferred existence. You stretched your neck for tender leaves and didn't need assistance. Your legs were awfully big, but they were actually quite skinny. There's really nothing on you that we'd classify as mini. Your fleshy upper lip produced significant dissension. So was it just a lip, or did it have an odd extension? Some say it's like a camel's face. They're reasonably clear, while others think it was a snout, just like today's tapir. You are the largest mammal that we have ever discovered, and we await the day for more remains to be uncovered. Now listen for alliteration coming up in this next line. No matter what we call you, you should surely be saluted as Earth's most massive mammal, or at least till that's refuted. Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching episode 52 of Mr. Mike's Dino-A-Day, brought to you by the Mechanicsburg Learning Center. Every day, live, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do this. Make sure you subscribe if you're on YouTube. We really appreciate that. Thanks from the Paraceratherium, also known as Sgrignoli. And we'll do it again tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, live. Thanks.